Center for Ethics and Leadership, the University of Houston, for hosting this CARE forum. It's just a wonderful place I found over the years. Yeah, I mean, as an anthropologist, I'm really excited about getting feedback from people from a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds. I would love to know what you think of this kind of work that I'm doing. But yeah, the CARE forum has been wonderful. It's I've always come away from it, just more inspired and humbled and curious about this thing we call care. And hopefully this talk will contribute something to that conversation today. I also want to acknowledge the funding for this project came from the Social Science Research Council and their Abe Fellowship Program. So I want to thank them. This was some research that right now it's in, various publications are sort of at various stages, but the chapters that I circulated are parts of a book that is due to be published by Vanderbilt University Press. I think September is what they're telling me now, is when it's going to come out. So that's really exciting. It's this new work. As Dan mentioned, I had written about care previously in different contexts, and my most recent book that was published, Fragile Resonance, was really about people who were being cared for by family members, by unpaid carers, right? And I was really interested after writing that book to look at the lives of people who didn't have family around to take care of them in Japan. I wondered what they did. And so the direction that I went with that is to look at people who have been affected by the criminal justice system, formerly incarcerated, older people, and to see what their lives are like. So that's kind of where this project, the idea for this project came from. I'm going to read a bit, I think, for my talk. Hopefully I'll be able to stick to time here, but I want to start out my talk, if I can advance the slide, with a story. So it's about mid-December, right, 2006. And it was just around the time of almost Christmas. A man named Fukuda Kyuemon, 74-year-old man, very sort of slight, 5'3" about, was just released from prison, Fukuoka prison in Western Japan. And he had no family to take care of him. He had no one to act as his guarantor outside of the prison. So he had no one to go to, and he ended up sort of serving his entire sentence in prison without parole and without sort of supervision afterwards. He only had a few thousand yen that he was able to earn working in prison. And so from the time he was released, he was pretty much living homeless. So he attempted to get arrested again and return to prison. He went to a shop and he stole some things, and then he immediately turned himself into the police. But unfortunately, they did not detain him. Unfortunately for him, didn't work out. They didn't detain him. They instead suggested that he go and register and get some public assistance funding. So he went to the ward office and asked them for public assistance. He said, he just got out of prison. He's been homeless. And they said, well, if you don't have, your proper identification, you don't have an address, we can't arrange this public assistance for you. So they ended up, one of the staff members noticed that he was from Kyoto, and so suggested that he go there to get assistance. So they gave him a train ticket, but he didn't understand what was going on. He didn't understand what he was supposed to be doing or why. He ended up disembarking the train at Shimonoseki in a neighboring prefecture in Yamaguchi Prefecture. By the time he got there, it was late. He didn't have a place to stay, so he just planned to stay there at the train station overnight. At about 2 a.m. in the morning, January 8th, 2007, He lit a small fire in a outdoor trash can of a fast food restaurant near the train station. But it was a windy night, and the flames, eventually the building, the train station building, which was very old and wooden, caught fire. And it was with the wind, the flames reached, they say, 20 meters high. It was a huge fire, completely destroyed the station and an area of about 4,000 square meters all around it. So this is a photograph here of the sort of aftermath of that fire. Um, Fukuda-san was unharmed. Nobody else was harmed in this fire, thankfully. But he was quickly discovered near the site and arrested. And now, this was not his first time being arrested for arson. This was actually his 11th time. And in all, over his lifetime, 50 of his 54 years of adult life had been spent in prison in Japan. Now, prisons are hardly an ideal environment for someone who is older and frail, but for Fukuda-san, it was a place that was familiar, it was secure, and he was more accustomed to the order and rhythm of prison life than life on the outside. And this was also a place where in his intellectual disability also had less effect on everyday life. He could sort of get by in a prison a little bit easier than he could in the sort of precarious world outside. 9 years after this incident, it's called the Shimonoseki arson incident, Fukuda was released from prison. And a couple of years after that, I saw him appear at an event arranged by the Center for Prisoner Rights, and a nonprofit organization in Tokyo. So at a screening of, it was at a screening of a short documentary about he was invited to the microphone, and immediately the audience, 100 people or more, cheered and erupted in applauses. And it was really quite a scene. He's very soft spoken. He was very nervous, holding his hands behind his back there. And they placed a microphone in front of him. And the host asked, how are you doing? And he kind of stumbled over his words a little bit flustered, understandably, and said, everything's good. And then, another round of applause for him. And the host said, Fukuda-san, now all these people here can see you in real life, and they can see what I see, that you're not some kind of scary monster or something. You're really quite cute. So the audience laughed a little at this, right? And Fukuda-san nodded and he kept quiet. And they proceeded to talk a little bit about his life, occasionally turning to him for some kind of confirmation of a detail. So at one point, the film director says, so why was it that you lit this fire? And Fukuda says, it was cold. It was cold. Well, what were you thinking after you thinking of doing after you lit it? I don't know. I don't know. He kind of stumbled a bit more, right? And he kind of laughed at himself. He was shaking quite nervously. I mean, the entire scene was making me feel quite uncomfortable as I watched it. And I wish they would just let this poor man sit down. The stuttered, the broken, the unsettled responses, however, really reminded me of a lot of the interviews that I had been doing with other formerly incarcerated men. Um, these pauses, these silences, these stutters in these interviews were sometimes a struggle for me to sit with. And there were times where I doubted my abilities as an ethnographer, or why am I doing this research at all? Should I be doing this? I felt increasingly like an unwelcome intruder on the lives of these strangers. Um, Even while I was encouraged by other individuals and other organizations to amplify their voices. But it felt as if aging to them was no longer legible in this sort of linear flow of experiences and memories. But it was more like a shuffled deck of cards. There was no way to tell how much of this was due to age-related, decline, cognitive impairment, or how much of it was shaped by this pattern of going back and forth from prison to the outside, this sort of day-to-day survival in these different environments with their own embodied rules of what could be said and what couldn't be said. Um, I'm happy to talk more about prisons and silence as well a little bit later. But as I got to know, I continued my field work there in Tokyo with formerly incarcerated older individuals. My perspective began to change and shift a little bit, not necessarily because they spoke more, but often because I could share more moments with them, sometimes in long silences together. You might say my approach became a little bit more caring. For those whose lives reflect the fragmented, often unsettling experiences of old age and incarceration, sometimes thinking about the past or speculating on the future is the wrong approach. Instead, presence, responsiveness, accompaniment, these were the forms of connection that made a space for being with. So this research was an invitation for me to really rethink a lot of what I had assumed about ethnography and oral testimonies and narratives and so on, and appreciate the shapes of these silences, but also the kind of rhythms of what was said and what was not said, what was expressed about settledness and unsettledness that couldn't be put into words alone. So in the rest of the time I have, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways carcerality gives rise to certain forms of care, both within sites of detention, like jails and prisons, and on the outside, where welfare bureaucracies and support services are increasingly tied to carceral logics of control and surveillance. As the example of Fukuda-san here illustrates, many older Japanese people are using prison as a source of care, often falling into a pattern of repeat offending after struggling, I'll highlight that, after struggling to find a place of belonging after release. In other words, the roles of prisons and the welfare system have sort of reversed. Prison has become a place to access care, whereas the welfare system has become more punitive and associated with social exclusion and isolation. So this has been highlighted not only in the Japanese press, but also in the international press, as you can see here. And I think it's important to ask questions about this in the context of broader calls for the abolition of mass incarceration, which demands that we reimagine our communities as places where people, including those who are disabled, frail, or cognitively impaired, can live without the need for prisons. And for those who currently access care through incarceration, like Fukuda-san, this means understanding how that care can be disentangled from other forms of institutional exclusion, stigma, punishment that can come with incarceration. It also means looking at the ways formerly incarcerated older people imagine a good life outside of prison and what forms of care can support these visions. So there's one of these articles here, the one in the upper right. You say it says Japan's prison are a haven for elderly women. This was an article published in Bloomberg Business News in 2018, and it listed several profiles of incarcerated women, including one of a woman named Mrs. T, Miss T, age 80, who was serving her fourth term of 2.5 years. Her crime was stealing, was stealing cod roe, seeds, and a frying pan. And for that, she was put in prison for 2.5 years. Miss T explained, "I was in prison for the first time when I was 70, when I shoplifted. I had money in my wallet. Then I thought about my life. I didn't want to go home, and I had nowhere else to go. Asking for help in prison was the only way. My life is much easier in prison. I can be myself and breathe, however temporarily. My son tells me I'm ill and I should be hospitalized in a mental institution. Take it easy. But I don't think I'm ill. I think my anxiety drove me to steal. Prison is easy. This was a phrase that I heard in many of my interviews with older adults. Um, Not without qualification sometimes. One man told me, anything is better than prison. I don't ever want to go back. But still, life in the outside world is hard, and prison is easy. So some prisons have started to employ, you know, oops, care specialists. Um, they have, sort of adjusted their regime a little bit to make it more, a little bit easier for older inmates. Um, they have, and of course, um, and some have sort of had more training for general prison staff. They've been compared to nursing homes in the sense that prison officers are dealing more with incontinence than they are with insubordination. But it's not only the provision of basic necessities and the proximity to other people that make prison easy, but also the daily routines and rhythms of life. So not only was there a rhythm of care within prison, but the movement back and forth from prison to the outside became part of this rhythm, was integrated into what I come to understand as a kind of new form of temporal embodiment of aging. So this is one where the security of prison became more and more pronounced over time. As Carolyn Suffren observed in her ethnography of pregnant women in U.S. jails, women who go to jail in order to receive prenatal care, for example, sometimes have their babies while they are in jail. Rhythms of recidivism can make jail what she calls a source of constancy, a place of familiarity, routine, rest, safety, and a means of, quote, being at home in the world. Old age makes it difficult to divert formerly incarcerated individuals from this rhythm of recidivism into other temporal modes of belonging, mostly work or family life, right? It's difficult for them to get jobs, and they're often estranged from family. So they find themselves stuck within this kind of carceral circuit. Formerly incarcerated people's efforts to pursue their version of the good life within this circuit does not always follow a straight line, but results instead in a temporality of repetition and circulation. Their movement back and forth from one side of prison wall to the other is not only spatial, but also constitutes a temporal form of ethical world building, a refusal to be disposed of, a demand to be cared for, a kind of agency, I think. And this retemporalization of aging through the circuitous rhythm of recidivism is what carceral geographer Dominique Moran has described as doing time, or the spatiotemporal practices and politics of carcerality in specific instances that are constitutive of and constituted by the body. So by doing time across carceral states back and forth, older bodies effectively stitch these together. While recidivism is perceived as a failure by both the prison and probation services and by humanitarian resettlement assistance organizations, from the perspective of the formerly incarcerated older person, these rhythms are kind of a stitch work, right? And they do the work of repair, keeping together a world that is otherwise quite chaotic and wounded and in shreds. So in one encounter, I asked a formerly incarcerated man why so many people go back to prison. Why do so many older people go back to prison? He looked at me sternly and he just said, well, if you've been once, you go a second time. If you've been twice, you go a third. I waited for him to continue, but he simply leaned back and lit another cigarette. And the other older men that we were with nodded and let him have the last word. But these words, this kind of rhythm, this kind of looped around in my head the rest of the day. It was said so matter-of-factly. It really made an impression on me. If you've been once, you go a second time. If you've been twice, you go a third. This was the kind of rhythm that animated these kind of places where formerly incarcerated older adults often lived in these low-income communities, often in precarious circumstances. This was sometimes referred to as the world of Shaba. And Shaba is an interesting term here because it contains both the sense of hardship of life on the outside, but also the care that enables one to endure that hardship. So Shaba originates from a moral cosmology of Buddhism, and it has been described as sort of the antithesis of the Pure Land, a world of defilement over purity, relativity over the absolute. Shaba, in other words, implies a state of things bound in a cycle of karmic suffering that is only overcome through a change in moral consciousness. So Shaba was the word, it was kind of prison slang for freedom, for the world outside of prison. But it also had this impression that life was hard in Shaba. So there's a saying that says it's colder in the wind of Shaba than it is inside the prison walls, right? Shaba no kaze wa hei no naka yori tsumetai. So on release, ex-offenders typically have no place of residence, no family ties to rely on, and very little money. And for those who return to low-income areas, Shaba means a place like this, a single occupancy room in a flop house with a shared toilet and bathroom down the hall. The rooms I visited were like this, were a little bigger than closets. A single futon almost occupied the entire floor space, leaving just enough room to squeeze around one side and place a shelf or a TV table on one end. Clothes would be hanging around the room. There's no wardrobe, right? They sort of hang them on drying racks there, as you can see. The carceral circuit repeats the architecture of enclosure and confinement with these kind of rooms, just as the world of Shaba encloses one in karmic consequences of past deeds. It might be what Ghassan Haj has called the bearable life, hovering between viable and the non-viable, an abject version of a life within limits. So spending a night at one of these shelters in a low-income area like this, I asked the attendant what he thought about this problem of older people and recidivism. And he said, it's more like living in Shaba is harder than prison. Among the people we support, there are several who have gone back to prison because they wanted to. They wanted to return, and that's why they went back. I think there've been a lot. I said, because they feel more secure there. Well, that's what it seems like to me. If that's the case, we can't stop them. They want to go, so they go and get caught shoplifting. There are people like that. In prison, you don't have to think about anything. In the world, you have to think about all kinds of things. You're renting an apartment. What should I do for food today? What will happen to me if my livelihood assistance runs out? You have to think about so much. In prison, there's none of that. So I ask, when you come out, you're free, but not really independent. These days, long-term care policy is all about, independent lives, independent aging. And he says, it's really hard, isn't it? Think about it. You're in your 70s and 80s and you've just left prison and they say, go and be independent. It's impossible. You don't have a job. You can't even rent an apartment. You're alone anyway. So this man discussed several cases of other formerly incarcerated older people with me who'd rented beds in the shelter. And at one point, he got a file from a nearby shelf of a client who had died recently, and he showed me that this man had been arrested 18 times and imprisoned 18 times since the age of 60 until he died. And I said, spent most of the last 20 years in prison. He said, yeah, for us, prison's a place you go when you've done something bad. For them, it's going home. That's their home. So the bed where this man spent his last days was this room at the foot of the staircase in this shelter, reserved for very ill and dying patients, or residents, really. While most of the building's interior was very dull and undecorated, the walls of this room were covered with photographs of shelter residents and staff and birthday cards, a poster of two women dressed in kimono, colorful calendars, and a clock. While the bed might be viewed as a setting of a tragedy of unbelonging or disbelonging, the visual liveliness of the decorations expressed the potential to be with others, at least, I think, synchronized in time's body. One woman who studied older underclassmen in Yokohama, Ji-Yoon Kim, describes the ways caregivers and receivers synchronize temporalities, attuning not only to bodily states, but also to temporal afflictions of irregular lifestyles in these kind of precarious circumstances. The synchronization provides time for movement, rest, rhythms of attunement, and moral agency, rather than the mechanistic kind of churn of regimented care of prison life. Kim argues that the dominant affective and moral qualities of temporal care in Shaba is not hope, but endurance. I think I'm starting to go over time, but I'm going to, if I can, just quickly talk a little bit about Mother House, because that featured in the readings a little bit. So Mother House was started by Igarashi Hiroshi, this man here, and it was kind of inspired by his realizing that there were all these older people that didn't have a place to go, they didn't have a home outside of prison. And would eventually go back and seek that sense of home in prison. He also was someone who provided care to other older inmates in prison. So the prison officers would often assign the care of older inmates to other inmates, and they would have to take care of them and bathe them and do all those kind of daily tasks. But he said elderly care in prisons is hell. Nobody teaches you anything. There's no one who knows anything about it. You know, it's just things like do it this way, do it that way. No one teaches you. So they just throw you in the deep end and you got to do the real thing with no prep. All of a sudden, it's change that person's diaper, take that person to the bath, change that guy's clothes, all just gets in, all just get in and do it right away. So he said, for me, the biggest thing was that what Mother Teresa said about helping the person in front of you. Love that person right in front of you. Really attend to their suffering. I was able to learn that through doing elder care in prison. So I think he's a good example of how these conditions of the prison can emerge a certain kind of consciousness and sensitivity and sense of care, even within those very limited conditions. Another example I talked about in that chapter that I circulated was G. He was the oldest member of Mother House when I visited. I spent a lot of time with G, a lot of time in silence. In some respects, G was very isolated. He's kind of this, case study in sort of isolated, formerly incarcerated older person. He was living with a disability. And he was even arrested again during my field work, shortly into my field work, after stealing about 20 yen. So that's like 20 cents, right? Out of a donation box in front of a Shinto shrine there. But he was arrested, and because of his prior record of incarceration, he was looking at up to a year in prison before Mother House came and was able to negotiate to have his sentence commuted. But he was still sort of living in a very precarious situation as a result of his arrest. His benefits were removed. He had no place to stay because he lost his apartment and so on. So life was very tumultuous for G. But even despite all the issues that he had, and somewhat because of his age and his disability, this became kind of an opportunity for him to make bonds with other formerly incarcerated members of Mother House and to forge kind of kinships with them. So I described the scene where he's taken to the memory clinic, and this other man in the cap here takes him. Many times he's misrecognized as a son or a relative, um, but it's in that space, and it's through those acts of care that a family member typically would do that I think a new kind of kinship was made between the two of these, and the fact that they shared that experience of having been in prison was also something that drew them together. Um, Going through this is my last slide. Yeah, I see, let's see. Aisha Khan wrote that in the context of U.S. carceral state, was drawing on scholars like Ruth Wilson Gilmore to argue that the relationships and networks that people forge under the circumstances of the carceral state are kinship formations, emerging from processes of reentry and the communities created and returned to as people live with and against carceral conditions. And she sees these kind of kinship relations, these new forms of kinship emerging out of the carceral as reparative and as instances of care that can challenge carceral systems. So it was this opportunity to forge these new kinships. In the case of G, it was his vulnerability, his disability that precipitated these acts of care. Um, Right. The other formerly incarcerated people, were helping him out throughout his kind of journey, and we're there with him as long as he stayed with Mother House. He became ill later on, was hospitalized, and it was the people of Mother House that were there by his bedside, providing that care. No one else was. Um, Here, that is another instance in which new forms of human being, of being with, have been created, as you can see in the picture, multi-generational even, and give me a little bit of hope, right? That there are other ways, other visions of aging outside of prison. But it takes us to expand our ideas of kinship and expand those ideas of the possibilities of care to really make that happen. Thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to take any questions and comments, and apologies for going on a bit long.
Thank you very much. No apology needed. That was that was beautiful. Hearing all that, and very profound and sad in many ways for me to hear all that. Let me open the floor for questions. You can use again. You can use the raise hand function, or you can just wave at me like that if you want something. I think maybe so Asha has, but let me get, I think maybe let me Virginia and Eva, and then I'll go to you, Asha. Let's see, Virginia, why don't you go ahead? Oh, you're muted. Ask to unmute there. You're still muted for, oh, there we are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. I find what you described just remarkable. I had not heard of anything like that. Can you say anything about whether there are similar sorts of happenings in Europe anywhere or in the US? Or how specific is this to Japan, what you describe?
Yeah, I think this is in many ways Japan's case is very particular. The fact that older so prison populations around the world are to some extent aging in Europe and in the United States, but often this is because the sentences are becoming longer and people are spending more time in prison or things like that. It's not often that older people are committing crimes or doing this in order to go to prison. It does happen, especially folks who are, homeless and maybe around winter time. We see a sort of rise in people that are entering prisons and those kind of spaces. But in Japan, it's very frequent that a lot of these older people are committing crimes as older people and going back, and about I think about 70% of those who are in prison in Japan, older people in prison, are repeat offenders. So it does become this pattern. That's also kind of unique. But really, there's a lot of groups in Japan that are looking at Europe, at the United States, and trying to get ideas about how to deal with this and how to create these communities outside that can provide a place for people and do that sort of reparative work. So there's some, I'm sure there's some sort of innovations there, but and there's things that have to do particularly with older formerly incarcerated people. So that's going to be something new and probably will be shared with other aging populations in the future. Hope that answers the question.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Virginia.
Okay, so now I'll just go down the line. So I'll go to Asha and then Eva and then Jenny. So Asha?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for this paper and for the presentation. I think it's a really interesting project. And I wondered, as you were talking and as I read the paper, I was thinking about the relationship between belonging and, meeting basic needs and incarceration, and interpreting it through a sort of American lens in terms of our structures of incarceration. So, one of the things that marks incarceration in the US, of course, is the racial sort of disparities. There's a wonderful article by Bryant et al. And Laurie Gruen's book, The Ethics of Captivity, in which they talk about these authors who are incarcerated, individuals who are Black men, talk about the phenomenology of the separation of sort of the role of the line in the prison, the way that they're treated as other by the guards. And I wondered if this kind of othering is lacking in Japanese prisons, and if that's one of the reasons that they can secure, that people are able to secure a sense of belonging there. So in both cases, perhaps one might say that basic needs are being met. And so my question to you is whether there are any sort of ethnic categories or that are marking, the prison guard population in relation to the prisoners, or rather, is it a homogeneous ethnic milieu? And so do we have this kind of, do we have the absence of that additional harm that we see in the US prisons? Is it absent in the Japanese context?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think this is another thing that sets Japan apart from a lot of the context in which abolitionists and sort of those who've been working against mass incarceration are doing their work, especially in the United States. Is that there is not a large foreign prison population in Japan. I mean, say foreign, but sort of ethnic minority prison population in Japan. They are perhaps a little bit overrepresented, but the numbers are very small to begin with. And they are only in few certain prisons in Japan. So that doesn't play as big of a role. It's not sort of as evident in there. I think the prison officers are very interesting, though. They often the sort of slang for prison officers, and if you're in prison, is oyaji, which means kind of like your old man, right? Your dad, kind of that's looking after you, right? And a lot of I mean, there is some friction, but there's a lot. I've heard a lot of stories about people sort of really getting along with the prison officers in ways as well, or prison officers, paying special attention as well. So there does seem to be that sense. And again, I think, I was reminded a lot of this when I was reading Carolyn Suffren's work, and she was working in the States, but in jails with women. And she describes a lot of times the ways in which the prison officers were taking care of pregnant women in jails and so on, and were really kind of a helpful presence for them, and it helped sort of give them that sense of community, perhaps. And I was reminded of that. When I was leaving my field site, by the way, they gave me a T-shirt that said Oyaji on it. So there's ways in which the anthropologist was also kind of like a prison officer in a way, but also kinship. There's a kinship there, I think. I'm gonna choose
What
to.
I'm gathering from you is that they're not abusing the prisoners. There isn't sort of
Well, there is abuse that happens in prison. I think for sure. And Japanese prisons are very, very strict about a lot of things. They their silence is observed right there throughout the day. So prisoners are not allowed to speak to each other. They're not even allowed to sort of face each other. One of the things that's people were telling me is like if you had two lines of prisoners that were sort of walking in opposite directions down a hall. One line would have to face the wall, and so that they're not looking directly at the other prisoners that were marching the other way, for example. There are a lot of these kind of embodied routines like that. But anyway, silence throughout the day. They were allowed to talk between about 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the evening, but only with the people in their cell. So it was very, a lot of the strict rules like this. But for the older offenders, mostly, they're quite compliant with these rules. If you break the rules and things like that, you can, be punished, separated, kind of put in a kind of stress position or something like that for an extended period of time. There's that kind of thing that does go on. I'm sorry, is that what you meant? So they're not nice places, but again, for the older prisoners who are sort of, if they adjust to these routines and they're going along and being compliant, it's kind of easy and they can sort of live without sort of thinking about too much.
yeah, and it sounds like there isn't the sort of ethnic othering there. But I'll let us go to the next question. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, but there definitely are, issues, I think, of disability and things like that. About 14% that's the estimate, 14% of older incarcerated people are living with dementia, for example. And this is often something that prison officers sometimes just ignore instead of actually dealing with. And that's never good. So sorry, lots of issues with prisons.
Eva?
I'm sorry to bring it away from the issue of prisons, which are
Oh, that's fine.
it's just really important. But it reminds me of a number of things having to do with people with intellectual disabilities, and as you say, some of the folks you're talking about have intellectual disabilities, either that are brought about by dementia or are prior to dementia. So my daughter, for example, who has a very significant cognitive disabilities, she really thrives through rhythms of going back and forth. She lives now at in a group home, a very, very, very good group home, has nothing like your prisons, either good prisons or bad prisons. But it was so striking that on Sunday morning, after she's had her French toast, she is ready to go back. And it is this kind of regularity of rhythm that is so important to her. And I think the rhythms within the house as well, they're very, very cognizant of that. And so there's something very important about this rhythmic and quality to life. The other thing that I wanted to mention is this is particularly interesting in light of the kinds of debates there are now within the disability community in the United States, and not only in the United States, I know in Europe as well, about whether or not residential services are a good idea, or whether people with disabilities should be in the community.
Yeah.
And, you know, for not just for your guys, but for people like my daughter as well, the community is the residential place. It is what creates a community, and it's very difficult to get this across. And it's always seen. It's often parents who are fighting for the right for, you know, for people to be in residences like my daughter's. And it's very difficult to get across the idea that it's not just because we're parents, you know, that you know, because the view is always these people can't speak for themselves, and therefore, you know, it's the parents who are imposing this on their children, blah, blah, blah. And it's not the case. And I think in a sort of perverse way, your study of people sort of voluntarily going into these more routinized and, you know, punitive, I mean, let's face it, carceral institutions are punitive, voluntarily, because of this, the sorts of questions of community and residence, and not having, and being able to be the dependent selves that they are, without the stress of, you know, independence as being, you know, the way to live. So I haven't read your work yet, but I'm very anxious to do so. So thank you very, very much for this talk.
Oh, thank you so much. It means so much to hear that. I think that's wonderful. This rhythmic quality of life, I think is important, right? It is about quality of life, and rhythms are part of it. And I also think that you're right. You know, there are some people who are kind of thinking about, you know, should we do nursing home abolition as well, right? Is that just sort of not the way that we need to be treating older people, right? I mean, and there's
Improving the
certainly,
conditions.
right. I mean, there's some good arguments there. I think in the ways in which, you know, these kind of sites of sort of institutionalization of older people have arisen and how they've been formed. But you know, there are also some really wonderful institutions that are embedded in community and that have, you know, excellent care going on. But I do like this idea of this sort of, you know, people being able to be the dependent selves that they are, right? Absolutely. And that is something, it does really clash with this idea that this sort of paradigm that you go into prison, and then once you get out, you're free, and you take care of yourself, and you can make all your decisions, and that's the way that you live a good life, right? And you're no longer dependent. And so a lot of these guys are just, you know, especially if they've been in prison for a long time, they can't relate to people anymore. They've sort of lost a lot of that ability after being in prison, and they become, you know, very isolated. A lot of them were very sort of independent minded to begin with, I found out, actually, you know, and that's kind of one reason they might have gotten into trouble. But coming out was another issue, and it was very difficult for them to find places where they could be could you know, be that dependent person, interdependent person in a way. So Mother House was, and that was a really good example, I thought, of a place where the director was really trying to not just create a kind of, you know, like a therapeutic community, not just a sort of a peer community, but really trying to nurture relationships of sort of mutual care amongst the different members. And so even though it was quite difficult at times to take care of G, you know, he thought, okay, the other guys are going to benefit from this, and this is going to be, you know, this more of this family. I think what places like that do need, though, however, is a little bit more expertise and a little bit more training from people who do have experience caring for older people, people with chronic, you know, health conditions and so on. I think there is still a huge need for that. But yeah, part of that was because in that context, you know, dependence was a way of nurturing a caring self that could be sort of restored out of this, you know, really this trauma of incarceration, I think. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Jenny?
Hi. So first, thank you so much. I hadn't read your work before. I look forward to reading more of it. So I have two questions that are very different in some ways, but ultimately connected, I think. So first, I'm wondering about how much conversation there has been in Japan connecting this elder care crisis to the work care regime in Japan generally, right? Very, very long hours of work, more and more women entering full-time work, but without any change in the structure of work, without any accommodation for who's going to do all that care. Are people talking about that link? But then the second question, the thing that really puzzled me when I did manage to read the first part of your paper, was how is it that in a culture that has all this language of relationship, right, the centrality of relationship, how do you get neoliberalism going? I mean, how did that, you know, take off as I mean, of course, it has happened everywhere in the world, but you might expect some resistance to this individualistic approach when there's a whole language and culture of the centrality of relationship.
Oh, wow, those are fantastic questions. Thank you so much. The first one is about the connection between the elder care crisis and the work conditions. Is that
Yeah,
is
the
that
structure of
correct?
work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a huge question, but a fair one. Yes, of course, there's and this kind of links to the, yeah, as you said, the neoliberalism question, because the kind of answer, or the kind of policy-led sort of direction that is coming out of this is, you know, be more independent, you know, take care of yourself and your health, and, you know, all this so that you won't need care in later life. So it's a kind of active aging paradigm. And that's been the thing that they've been promoting. It's not, you know, is it working? It's not really working that great, I think. You know, there's still a huge care labor shortage in Japan. You still have huge numbers of family members that are providing care, having to quit work because of care, women and men, mostly women, of course. But you know, a lot of problems that are happening. So I don't think that they've really been able to solve it with this sort of neoliberal model. But nonetheless, the kind of structure of the market of elder care is sort of being based around that in a way. In reality, family are pitching in quite a lot. And they're the ones to fill in the gap. But yeah, I mean, I've talked to lots of Japanese people about this, and they kind of don't know themselves. They kind of say, "Well, we're just being abandoned." You know, the government's just saying, you know, we can't care for you. Sorry, and they're just sort of letting these older people die like that. And so it is a crisis. It is a difficult situation.
Do you hear
Um,
pushback that calls on this language of N, of relationship, of, you know, people trying to say, but we have this whole
yeah.
tradition and this doesn't fit?
For sure, yeah. People are thinking about N, they're thinking about you know, connections and kizuna, right? And all of these words, tsunagari. They have a lot of different ways of thinking about that. And it's there is somewhat, you know, these things happening on community levels here and there, but yeah, I think it's there's a lot of people that have also, unfortunately, I think they're kind of resigned to this
Mhm.
idea of Muen Shakai, right? A sort of connectionless society. And I think that's it's sort of lost hope for those other ways of being, right, and belonging to each other. I think places like some of these places like the low income areas where a lot of people go after they've come out of prison that I looked at are interesting because you do have a lot of charity organizations and sort of more grassroots kind of interesting organizations that are coming in there to do work with the homeless population and things like that, and trying to build connections and trying to think about how to forge those connections. And to some extent, they are drawing on these ideas of connection and sort of moving against this sort of neoliberal paradigm. But yeah, I do think that this is taking over, and I do think it's driving a lot of anxiety about old age, because it's all about, it's up to me. I have to, stay healthy and fit so I don't, become dependent. Then, people get, I think, quite anxious about, what's going to happen to me when I'm older, and old age in general, becomes a kind of source of fear and anxiety for the society, which is also unusual for a society that is sort of more traditionally, really valued and cared the senior, the older people, right? So that is a change. So neoliberalism, that is a powerful force. And it's been since about 2000 when they introduced a more sort of market-based kind of idea of long-term care in Japan. It's been, promoted and sort of more institutionally sort of organized, I think. It's become a business, and care is a business, and people who are care users are customers, right? And so that is the new model.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to take this chance to ask a couple of questions.
Great.
Like the questions that have come before, I really enjoyed this talk. I mean, I think Virginia started out saying that she was completely unaware of this, and I was too, and this is really fascinating. And as I said right after your talk, very, very sad, but I have three questions about this. They're kind of related, sort of tiered, building on one another. First, I was hoping you could say just a little bit more about the nature of incarceration in Japan, because you mentioned some, that it has some undesirable aspects and some odd aspects. The silence, but it seems like it's much better than, say, your average Texas prison is, where temperatures in the summer, we have prisons without air conditioning, so temperatures reach 110, 120 degrees inside. So it seems better. So I'd just be interested, just kind of to learn a little bit more about that. Secondly, you still, I mean, at least if I heard you correctly, you resist. You're still kind of looking for alternatives outside of prison for these individuals, which seems right. But at the same time, I wonder about maybe rather than resisting this, resisting these elderly people going into prison. Perhaps maybe we, thinking about accepting it and reforming prison to better suit, a life in prison. So, for example, it might be nice for them to be able to talk to people other than, for 3 hours a day. So that, to actually to allow them to create these caring communities within prison. But then this gets to my third point, which is, kind of relating to some of the things you were talking to Eva about. But you know, just these thoughts about that some people are getting from prison, from something about the structure of prison, something that they can't get outside of prison, and what that means. You know, that they're for this kind of these visions of a good life that can't perhaps be accessed. You know, you talked about things like you know, freedom from the world outside. That prison provides this. And maybe only prison provides this, right? Because otherwise you are on the world outside, which is a really interesting idea. And if I'm being honest, I mean, it has a tiny bit of appeal to me. You know, this idea of you just, you know, you escape. And so you know, I mean, this is kind of just letting my imagination wander. You know, I was thinking, like, is there this kind of an appeal? I mean, if someone were to set up, you know, just kind of giant dorms in cities and say, you know, you can, you know, you can just check yourself in for a year and you know, it's going to be very regimented, and you're going to have to follow certain rules, but you know what, you're going to be fed, you're going to be safe, there's going to be a rhythm, and you know, for a year you live here, and you know what, you're kind of shut off from the world. You don't have to worry about all the stuff outside, and even, you know, even people, even your family can only visit you in certain structured time, right? You're just going to be unavailable. I wonder if there's an appeal. You know, I mean, like, this is a very, right, it's a very different idea of care and a very different idea of a good life than we have. But
Maybe.
I don't know. I mean, it's, you know, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
right, it doesn't sound too different than a nursing care home, right?
Yeah.
In a way, right, where you might not be allowed to sort of freely, you know, move about or leave, you know, or something like that, where there might be a sort of you know, regimen of activities or meals or something that that you might have to follow. So I mean, there might be, you know, it's comparable to that. In that case, why have you know, um, yeah, you know, shouldn't, I think probably prisons shouldn't be filling that role. I think, but I think, you know, certainly one of the issues is that for these older people that are going to prison, a lot of them, again, they don't have sort of family, right? They don't, their children or whoever family they might have had is sort of not around. And so that's often a problem because when they go in front of a judge or something and they're being charged and they had this minor crime, if a family member's around, they would come and they would, you know, speak on the person's behalf, and they would say that they're going to take care of them if they're, you know, their sentence is commuted or whatever. And so oftentimes then the judge will not you know, sentence them to prison, but allow them to stay in the community and stay in their family, right? So often these are people who don't have family. So that might have to change, right? We have to think of other options for people at that stage, other places they might be able to go where they can receive, you know, what they need without having to go to the general prison, you know, into the general prison population. I think that's one thing, you know, and maybe these would be places that would have less stigma attached to them. But right now, that kind of those kind of options are not really there. They're very few. A lot of care homes also, once people come out of prison, won't take people who have been to prison. They have concerns about that. So oftentimes it's hard for people to enter into that kind of another kind of institutional lifestyle where they might be around other people and have activities. Because they're excluded from those places. So that's also a problem. So I think in both senses, you know, you might need a little bit more imagination and options about what, you know, people can do. But yeah, I think there's a more there could be more caring places than prison. Prison is not yeah, a very nice place. It is very strict. You I think the food is awful. People always talk about how awful the food is. So there are a lot of issues with that. But you know, um, It's interesting. I think women, one thing I would love to do, or I'd love another person to do, is a little bit more work with women, older women coming out of prison, because they seem to have a very different experience. And sort of the women I've been able to talk to, often they've had family around when they went into prison, but they've had sort of family conflicts. They've had sort of fights with their family, or things like that, and that's often what precipitates them going into prison. So again, that kind of confinement as a means of escape from your family, but also their experience in prison is maybe different too. So again, I haven't talked to that many people, but often they whilst they're in prison, they could sort of they talked about, oh, my son, or something, my son would write me letters or come and visit me, and I saved up this money from working in prison and I can give it to my grandchild or something like that. They still were kind of I don't know, finding ways in which they could I don't know, achieve some version of a good life, I think, through the prison, where they would stay connected to that family in some way, which I also found was sort of interesting. But maybe there are other options for people like that, right? I think work was a big thing, finding work, and because everyone has to work in Japan. Well, had to. And a couple years ago, they changed the law, so that you don't have to be sentenced to work in prison. And they changed it mostly because there's so many disabled older people in prisons now. Okay. So yeah, so resisting rather than or reforming, or that kind of issue, it was something that I guess I'm not quite settled on myself. I'm not quite sure. I think that yeah, as I said, probably alternatives are something that I'm thinking of more these days. But uh what was interesting to me is that even within these carceral spaces, there was, care going on that you can see and that people talked about and valued, right? Their depictions of prison were not, merely that this was a horrible place and, I couldn't wait to get out. There were often times, ways in which they had really meaningful experiences there, even though there were all kinds of bad ones as well. So there was kind of mixed feelings, and I just wanted to highlight that. I wanted to bring that out, the real full experience of these things, rather than, painting a very black and white picture. Often that's where we see the interesting human hair stuff, right? Is in that kind of muddy area. So that's what I'm doing.
Jenny wants to get back in here with a question.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Right. You can hear me now? Yes? So one of the things that characterizes North American prisons, even in Canada, is violence. They're just incredibly violent places. And it sounds like that these Japanese prisons, with all their strictness, that they're not characterized by violence, that this sense of security wouldn't be there. Whereas, I would think in North American prisons, people like the ones you were talking, they would be victims. They would be rightly worried about being preyed on. And even this idea of creating, shelters, highly regimented shelters, the reason that many homeless people don't want to be in those shelters is they're not safe in North America. People are attacked, their stuff is stolen. North America is so violent. As I say, even in Canada, which is much less violent in other ways, but institutionally in terms of prisons. So that's an important thing to picture. And so one more piece is that prisons in North America are incredibly expensive to run. They're a minimum of $40,000 per person per year. So if you just handed that money over, many people, and in Canada again, especially, only something like, I don't know, 10 or 15% of the prisoners are actually in there for violent offenses. It's otherwise not a particularly violent population. So, if you could create So I think the main thing is that the Japanese culture, which manages these institutions without violence, is a kind of prerequisite for this story.
Yeah,
That
yeah, that
doesn't
might be
seem
right. Yeah.
transferable. And that even this idea, well, could we create a less, in Japan, you'd think you could create a shelter instead, probably for the same cost or cheaper, without all of these restrictions, with that, you know, with not so many guards, and accomplish something very similar. But in North America, yeah.
No, absolutely. I think you're right. And you know, a lot of most of these guys, 95% of them, the older people in prisons are not there for violent offenses as well, right? Although that I think there's, you know, a growing number that are there for violent offenses, and that's its own thing. But I think the majority of them are absolutely not, right? It's you know, 75% of the older women in Japanese prisons are there for shoplifting. And usually it's something that is worth, I think the average is like 3,000 yen. So that's not even $30, right? It's really, it's like this woman who stole a frying pan. So there's very, very minor offenses, but part of this is that the law, those sort of broader laws, are becoming more and more punitive and less about rehabilitation. So they kind of get caught up in that, right? I mean, the law is supposed to be covering everyone, saying, okay, we're going to be really hard if you're going to, you know, if you if you commit a crime, you do the time, kind of thing, right? And that's politically very sort of expedient and popular. And there's a lot of victims' rights groups and things like that that are always pushing for harsher sentencing and so on, right? But as a result, all these people who commit very minor crimes are going and doing a lot of time, right? And being very expensive prisoners too, especially older people. They're even more expensive than your typical prisoner. So you know, you think, how does this make any sense, right? But it is going, I think, to you know, justify and sort of uh, support this larger system, this sort of punitive justice system, in the kind of name of law and order and so on. But you're right that within prisons, there's very, very little violence in Japan, of sort of prisoners, prisoner violence, at least. But there is sometimes, you know, cases of abuse by guards that come up, but not to the extent that we have them here in the UK or in the US and so on. There are some complaints sometimes about the conditions. Dan mentioned the sort of heat in the summer, and that's an issue in prisons in Japan too, as well as the cold in the winter, right? And the guys would always say, like, you know, I knew when someone was coming around for an inspection because they'd suddenly turn on the heat in the rooms, and we'd have, you know, have warm rooms, or something like that, right? But otherwise they didn't. So conditions can be quite harsh, you know, work conditions and so on. But yeah, again, I mean, there was one woman who was in there she could have gotten parole, but she said that she'd rather just stay for the entirety of the 3 years that she was sentenced in prison. She wanted to just stay there. You know, so it was livable, a livable life, bearable life, perhaps, right? But thank you,
Thanks.
Jen. You're right. You're right. It makes these comparisons very difficult sometimes. Oh, I'm almost out of power. I'm gonna try to plug in my computer.
Are there other questions before Jason's power goes out? Thomas.
Yeah, thanks so much. I can wait for Jason for you to come back, or can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Great. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for the talk and the conversation. I was wondering, as you see it, what's the trajectory for this phenomenon in Japan over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and is there anything that might deviate that, or is it going to remain bleak?
Oh, question. Well, let's see. I do wonder about this. So the change in the the requirement for working in prison was sort of an indication to me that they are sort of moving along the lines of sort of figuring out ways to accommodate an aging prison population. I think they are rather sort of, there's this kind of, sense of, we must stop all these older people from coming to prison. We must stop them from, reoffending. But of course they will. We expect them to do this, and they're not doing anything about actually the conditions that are making it likely that they're going to reoffend, right? Or listening to them, or spending time with them to figure out what their lives are like. And so, yeah, my so yes, I'm not sure. But there are some organizations that have been set up by sort of in cooperation with the government. Mostly they are for helping to resettle people living with disabilities after prison. And I spent some time with some people who worked for those. I thought that was kind of interesting. It's not without some issues, but it's often can be a good way for older people to find some kind of suitable accommodations and life after prison. But it's good that that sort of started off, and I think once if those can be can grow and become better funded, I think they would be helpful. But they're very hard to run because they count on a lot of cooperation between local care institutions, care services, communities, and the prison. And often there's so much stigma around prison that communities say, "We want to resettle, someone who was in prison in our community? No way." So it takes a lot of work negotiating that still. So it would take a lot of effort, I think, to really scale it up on a national level. But right now, I think, yeah, I see this as something that needs a bigger voice. The issue of older people being affected by the criminal justice system in Japan. Along with people who are fighting for disability rights and things like that. I think they're sort of interconnected, and I think that it will have a bigger voice if these different groups, these different people who are all affected by the system are can find solidarity and kinship with each other, and that is ultimately my hope. Yeah. But I don't see any major changes on the horizon, Tom. Sorry.
Okay, well, I think we are at time. So I want to thank Jason. Thank you all for being here. That was a wonderful conversation. So thanks. And then I hope you all can join us for one last care forum this year on April 5th, same time, same place. So hope to see you there. And thank you, Jason.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed it. Bye now.
Bye.